On the sweltering evening of August 24, 1814, a magnificent dinner was laid out in the dining room of the presidential mansion in Washington. Silverware gleamed dully in the candlelight of the candelabras. The finest wine languished in crystal decanters, and the aroma of freshly prepared dishes filled the space, promising an exquisite meal. The table was set for 40 guests, awaiting the arrival of high-ranking dignitaries and the leader of the young nation himself. However, those who eventually sat at this table were not invited. Their uniforms were red, reeking of gunpowder and road dust, and the mud of Maryland's swamps clung to their boots. British Admiral George Cockburn and General Robert Ross raised glasses of wine belonging to James Madison, and with a sarcastic smirk, toasted the health of __0_, the President of the United States, whom they had just forced to flee into the woods. This was a moment of supreme triumph for the British Empire and profound humiliation for America. The king's soldiers, laughing and discussing the ease of their victory, devoured the dinner intended for the American cabinet. They felt like masters of the situation, shapers of destiny, capable of wiping this experiment called democracy off the face of the earth. No one present in the room at that moment could have foreseen that this dinner would be the last event in the building's history before it turned into a torch, and that nature itself was already preparing a counterblow that would change the course of history no less than cannons and muskets. The scene in the dining room was merely a prelude to a fiery storm that was to cleanse the nation of illusions and forge it in the ashes of its own capital. To understand how an enemy army ended up in the heart of the American capital, eating the presidential dinner, one must rewind time and look at the global chessboard of the era. By mid-1814, the world had changed. In April of that year, Napoleon Bonaparte fell in Europe. The French emperor, who for many years had constrained Britain's military might, was exiled to the island of Elba. This event, seemingly distant from American shores, had fatal consequences for the United States. Britain, freed from the heavy war on the continent, could now unleash its colossal military machine to the west. Thousands of battle-hardened veterans who had passed through the crucible of war with France boarded ships. These were not recruits or militiamen, but professionals who knew how to hold formation under grapeshot and had tasted victory. Their goal was to punish the former colony, which, taking advantage of the metropolis's difficult situation, had declared war 2 years prior. A mood of revenge prevailed in London. Newspapers demanded that the audacious Americans be taught a lesson, and the Admiralty developed plans for devastating coastal raids. At the same time, a strange, almost somnambulistic sense of security reigned in Washington. The capital, barely 14 years old, was more an ambitious project than a real city. The wide avenues, drawn on maps, in reality sank in mud and thickets, while the monumental buildings of the Capitol and the President's House stood as lonely islands amidst swamps and pastures. Secretary of War John Armstrong was unshakably confident that the British would never attack Washington. Why would they want this backwater? Baltimore, a rich port, a strategically important hub, that was the real target. This strategic blindness led to the capital remaining practically defenseless. When the British squadron entered Chesapeake Bay in August, the threat became palpable. But the American command's reaction remained chaotic. The British landed in Benedict, about 40 miles from the city, and began their march. The heat was unbearable. The Maryland summer descended upon the soldiers in wool uniforms with all its humid weight. Men collapsed from heat stroke, but the column continued its movement, meeting no serious resistance. American intelligence was confused in its reports, claiming sometimes 5,000, sometimes 20,000 enemies. Panic began to seep into the minds of the city's inhabitants and defenders. The culmination of this chain of errors was the Battle of Bladensburg. This event went down in history under the sarcastic name __0_. On August 24th, American troops, consisting predominantly of poorly trained militia, took up positions at the bridge over the Anacostia River. President Madison personally arrived at the battlefield, becoming the first and only sitting president to come under enemy fire. But the presence of the head of state could not replace discipline and tactical training. When the British light infantry appeared, chaos ensued. The famous Congreve rockets, a new terrifying weapon of the time, whirred over the heads of the inexperienced militiamen. These rockets were not particularly accurate, but their psychological effect was devastating. The thunder, smoke, whistling, and the sight of an approaching wall of redcoats broke the spirit of the defenders. The lines of defense crumbled. Soldiers threw down their muskets and fled without looking back. The road to Washington was open. No barricades, no reserves, just an empty road leading straight to the heart of the nation. At this moment, the drama escalated to a new level, moving from the realm of military tactics to that of personal tragedies and decisions. While the army was scattering, its own battle was unfolding in the president's house. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, was waiting for her husband, having set that famous table. She heard the distant rumble of cannons. Couriers brought increasingly grim news. She was advised to flee immediately, but she refused to leave her post until one specific item was saved. It was about Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, a massive canvas in a heavy frame. Dolly understood that if this symbol fell into enemy hands, if it were paraded through the streets of London as a trophy, it would inflict a moral blow from which the nation might not recover. Amidst the chaos and panic, with servants already loading silver, she ordered the frame to be broken and the canvas removed. This action required incredible self-possession. While armed men fled the battlefield, a woman in a silk dress saved the country's honor by rolling up the canvas depicting the first president. Her carriage left the city literally hours before the British entered. President Madison, separated from his wife, wandered through the Virginian forests, watching the glow of the fire over the city that bore the name of the founding father. This was the depths of despair. The country's leader had become a fugitive, deprived of communication, an army, and shelter. But it was at this point of absolute vulnerability that an internal turning point began. For the British, the capture of Washington was not just a military operation, but an act of ideological retribution. Admiral Cockburn, driving down Pennsylvania Avenue, savored the moment. He hated the American press, especially the __0_ newspaper, which mercilessly criticized him, calling him a bandit and a pirate. Upon reaching the newspaper's editorial office, he personally ordered all equipment destroyed. His command was particularly cynical. "Destroy all the C's, so these scoundrels can never spell my name again." This was a war not only against an army, but also against words, against ideas, against the very possibility of criticism. As night fell, the city was illuminated by an ominous light. The British approached the Capitol. The building where Congress met was considered an architectural masterpiece, a symbol of Republican ideals. Soldiers broke down the doors and stormed inside. They didn't just set the building on fire, they made a ritual of it. Furniture, documents, priceless books from the Library of Congress. Everything was piled in the center of the halls. Gunpowder was used to make the flames spread faster. The fire was so intense that the glass in the lamps melted and ran like water. The books burned especially brightly. It was the destruction of memory, knowledge, the legal foundations of the state. Flames erupting from the Capitol windows were visible for many miles around, serving as a beacon of defeat for all who hid in the darkness. Then it was the turn of the president's house. After that very dinner, soldiers methodically set fire to the curtains, furniture, and floors. The magnificent mansion was transformed into a giant furnace. The roof collapsed, leaving only charred walls, looking into the night sky with empty window sockets. The Treasury and War Department buildings were also put to the torch. The city became an infernal landscape where the shadows of the invaders danced against the backdrop of the burning ruins of democracy. It seemed like the end. Washington was broken, the government scattered, the army demoralized. But it was precisely at this moment, when human forces had exhausted their capacity for destruction or salvation, that a force more ancient and powerful intervened. The next day, August 25th, the sky over Washington began to change color. The suffocating heat, which had lasted for weeks, reached its peak and began to transform into something ominous. The air became dense and still. The birds fell silent. British soldiers, engaged in looting and setting fire to the remaining buildings, anxiously glanced at the horizon. The sky took on a strange, greenish-yellow hue. This was not like an ordinary summer thunderstorm. This was an accumulation of atmospheric wrath. Suddenly, a wind of such force arose that it knocked people off their feet. A hurricane began, which locals would later call the Great Storm of 1814. Rain poured down like a wall, instantly turning the streets into raging rivers. But it wasn't just rain. The wind tore roofs from houses, uprooted ancient trees. Eyewitnesses claimed to have seen tornadoes forming, a phenomenon extremely rare for central Washington. The power of the elements was such that it lifted cannons into the air and hurled them to the ground like children's toys. British troops who were in open areas found themselves trapped. Soldiers, who an hour ago felt like invincible conquerors, now frantically sought shelter. Brick chimneys fell, burying the occupiers beneath them. According to various estimates, the storm claimed the lives of more British soldiers than American bullets in the Battle of Bladensburg. The chaos was absolute. Nature did not discriminate between right and wrong, but its intervention had a very specific strategic effect. The downpours that struck the city did what fire brigades could not. They extinguished the fires. The fire devouring the Capitol and the President's house hissed and retreated under the pressure of the water. If not for this deluge, the buildings could have burned to the ground, turning into a pile of ashes. The water saved the stone skeletons, preserving the structure that could later be restored. For the British command, the storm became a signal for retreat. General Ross and Admiral Cockburn, shaken by the fury of the elements and fearing that their ships in the bay might be destroyed, decided to immediately leave the city. The troops left in a hurry, abandoning the wounded and some of the loot. The night march back to the ships was terrible. Roads were washed out, trees blocked the way, soldiers were exhausted and frightened. They left not as victors, but as people fleeing the wrath of God. Thus, in a strange way, the destructive hurricane became the savior of the capital, expelling the invaders and preserving the ruins for future revival. When the storm subsided and the sun once again illuminated Washington, the returning residents were met with a scene of apocalypse. The air was permeated with the smell of wet ash and burning. Instead of majestic government buildings, there stood black, sooty boxes without roofs. Looters had scrawled offensive messages on the walls of the Capitol. The streets were strewn with debris. It seemed that the very idea of a unified state lay in ruins. At this moment, the nation faced its deepest identity crisis. In Congress, which was temporarily housed in the Patent Office building, the only surviving government building, heated debates erupted. Many congressmen, especially from the North, proposed relocating the capital. Why rebuild a city in a swamp that was so easily captured? Philadelphia or New York would be safer, richer, more convenient. The proposal seemed logical and rational. Washington had been discredited as a symbol of power. However, here a third layer of conflict came into play, an ideological one. James Madison and his supporters understood to abandon Washington now would mean admitting ultimate defeat. It would mean that the British had not just burned buildings, but had destroyed the will of the people. To leave the city would be to allow the enemy to dictate the geography of power. The decision to stay and rebuild the capital from the ashes became an act of the highest stubbornness and patriotism. It was a signal to the world: we can be burned, but we cannot be moved. The reconstruction process became a metaphor for the rebirth of the entire nation. The walls of the president's house were cleaned of soot, but the traces of fire had deeply ingrained themselves into the porous sandstone. To hide these scars, the walls were covered with a thick layer of white lead paint. It was from this moment that the building became brightly white, and the name White House became entrenched in popular consciousness, although it officially came into use later. This white color was not a color of purity from birth. It was a color that concealed scars, a symbol of a new page written over pain. Architect Benjamin Latrobe, who undertook the reconstruction of the Capitol, incorporated elements emphasizing American identity into the new design. Instead of classical Greek acanthus leaves on the column capitals, there appeared tobacco leaves and corn cobs, plants of the New World. The building rose from the ashes more American than it had been before the fire. But the main lesson that America learned from the ashes of 1814 concerned not architecture, but the national spirit. Until this moment, the United States was more a union of separate states, where each citizen felt himself first a Virginian or a New Yorker, and only then an American. The war, and especially the burning of the Capitol, created a common trauma and a common enemy. The humiliation of Washington united the nation in its desire to prove its worth. Just weeks after the events in Washington, the British fleet approached Baltimore. There, observing the bombardment of Fort McHenry, lawyer Francis Scott Key would write the lines that would become the nation's anthem. The _quote_0_ waving over the fortress acquired such powerful meaning precisely because everyone remembered the lowered flag in Washington. The victory in Baltimore became a direct response to the tragedy of the Capitol. The events of that August left a deep mark on the American psyche. They taught the young nation that freedom does not come free, and that the institutions of democracy are fragile. The Capitol and the White House ceased to be mere offices for officials. They became sacred symbols of survival. Every time a modern viewer looks at the Capitol dome or the White House facade, they see not just stone, but a monument to resilience. The story of the burning of Washington resonates today as a reminder that even the darkest moments of history can become a point of growth. The paradox is that the British, intending to humiliate and destroy the American government, actually strengthened its legitimacy. The fire destroyed documents and furniture, but it forged resolve. The storm that drove off the invaders was perceived by many as divine providence, confirmation that this country has a higher purpose. Returning in thought to that dining room where Admiral Cockburn drank the president's wine, we see the full irony of fate. The toast to Jemmy turned out to be prophetic, but not in the sense the British intended. Madison returned, the government returned, the city rose, and Cockburn's name remained in history primarily because of that very fire, which failed to destroy the American dream. Today, walking through Washington, one can see traces of those events, if one knows where to look. Some stones of the White House still bear pink and black fire marks beneath layers of paint. These are the hidden scars of a veteran who survived to become stronger. The story of the burning of Washington is not a story of defeat. It is a story of how, from the ashes of humiliation, the steel of national character is forged, and how sometimes a destructive storm is needed to clear the way for a new beginning. This lesson of resilience, the ability to rise after a knockout, remains perhaps the most important legacy of that brief but fierce war. The narrative of 1814 teaches us to look at crises from a different angle. A catastrophe that seemed like the end of the world to contemporaries, from the distance of centuries, appears as a necessary stage of maturation. Fire burns away the old, making way for the new. And in this eternal cycle of destruction and creation lies the secret of the vitality of any civilization capable of surviving its darkest nights and meeting the dawn, standing on the ruins of the past with plans for the future in hand.